Welcome, and thank you all for joining us. Being First is proud to sponsor Part 1 of this free two-part webinar series on the human dynamics of change. My name is Marcy Eckhart, and I will be your moderator for this session. Presenting the webinar today will be Being First CEO, Dean Anderson. At the conclusion of the session, Dean will be happy to address any questions you have. You may submit questions at any time during the session through the question and answer section of the webinar sidebar located on your screen. At this time, I would like to introduce Dean Anderson with the Human Dynamics of Change, Turning Resistance into Commitment.
Greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to be talking today about human dynamics and specifically turning resistance into commitment. Human dynamics are universal. We're all people and we all have these dynamics. We all have mental conditioning, habit patterns, ways of seeing the world, certain sets of values and beliefs. And in our exploration about resistance, in particular, how to turn it into commitment, in this session, we're going to start at the most surface layers around behavior and emotional responses. And in part 2 of this two-part series, we'll go deeper into mindset and the invisible causes of success and failure as it relates to the human dynamics that we can influence in our change efforts. And one of the really wonderful things about human dynamics is we're a walk-in laboratory. We ourselves are constantly dealing with our own human dynamics. And what I invite you to do in this webinar series is to think about not just the people that you lead or support and change in relationship to how you might influence the human dynamics occurring in them, but take the information that we talk about in these two sessions and apply it to yourself. Because the best laboratory we have is our 24/7 living with ourselves to begin to discover more deeply what causes our behaviors, what causes us the way that we think, what causes us to see the world the way that we see it, because that will greatly influence our understanding of human dynamics. Our perspective here is not just figuring out ways to make change efforts successful in terms of marginal results or average results. What we're really looking at is how do we unleash the human potential in our organizations while we're undergoing change so that we can achieve breakthrough results. So while the focus in a lot of ways will be on resistance, our main attention is placed on commitment, because commitment is a pathway to that level of breakthrough results. We have two objectives here. We're going to understand what causes resistance, and then we're going to learn strategies to turn resistance into commitment. We have 4 parts to our agenda. We're going to talk about the core human needs that are underlying resistant behavior. We're going to talk about the emotional transitions people go through when they're feeling resistant. And then we're going to talk about levels of commitment, and specifically strategies to deal with the human dynamics that move people from a place of resistance to commitment. Now, the starting place is to talk about us as people. We're multi-dimensional human beings. Clearly, we have a body where our behaviors and our actions show up. And in our change efforts, what we're looking to do is to be able to influence people's behaviors and actions so they can produce greater results. But underneath all behaviors and actions are the feelings that we have, the emotions that we have, and the energy level that releases towards our objectives of achieving great results. And underneath the emotional state that we feel at any moment, of course, is the mental assumptions and beliefs, the thoughts, the ways that we interpret what's happening around us. And those interpretations, they generate the emotional state we're in, which of course then generates the behaviors and the actions that lead to our results. And then at our core, all have a soul, a spirit, where we drive our purpose and meaning. So when we think about resistance and getting people to contribute in very positive ways from a committed perspective, we can't just think about their behaviors and actions. We've got to also deal with the emotional state they're in, the mental models they have that generate the interpretations that cause those emotional states, and then, of course, who they are as people and what they really value. Now, people don't resist change. This is something that just right from the start I'd like all of us just to let go of, this idea that people are resistant to change. They don't resist change. They resist being change. They resist change that's laid upon them from the outside, where they perceive the outcomes will be bad. Now, if I offered you $1 million, that'd be a great change in your life, I assume. And I assume you wouldn't resist that. So that content, it's a change, but you don't resist it because you like it. You like the outcome that it delivers. So when we talk about resistance, what happens is there's a core set of needs that we have that get triggered by the content of the change. Now, $1 million doesn't trigger those core needs. But if it was something that you might not like initially, then you become fearful that that change is going to bring with you an unresolved core need. And then what surfaces is behavior that looks resistant. And resistance goes away when people believe that their core needs will be met and that the future will be better than the past. So the perspective here is that people want to commit. There's a natural inclination to make things better. I mean, think about this. All innovation, all paths to improvement, all development, all growth, everything that turns out better than it is today, all of that occurs through the path of change. So essentially, change is and can be an extremely powerful positive force in anyone's life. So what we're trying to look at here is that if it's so positive, then why do people resist? And to understand that, we have to get below the body into emotions in the mind. So right now we're going to look at the core human needs that get triggered in times of change quite often. Now these aren't all the needs, of course. If you've studied psychology and things like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, there are other needs that humans have. What we found in our 30 years of research, though, is that these are the 7 core needs that get triggered in change efforts. So there's security, inclusion, power, control, competence, justice and fairness, and the desire to be liked and connected. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk us through each of these core needs, and then I want to talk about strategies to help people resolve the core needs. Because when we're seeing resistance on the surface in behaviors, you can rest assured that one or more of these core needs are being triggered in people. Now all of us have these core needs, all 7 of them. All of us also have usually 2 or 3 that are primary for us. And so they become the essence of our style in terms of who we are. If we're leaders, they're the essence of our leadership style. For example, if I have a large core need around power and control, I'll tend to be a kind of command and control leader. But if I have a strong core need around justice and fairness, then I might be an inclusion. I might be a far more collaborative leader. These are also our hot buttons. You know, these are the things that when people say something and we get triggered emotionally, often what's going on below the surface is that one of our core needs has been triggered. So let's look at the first core need, security. This is the basic security need that Maslow talked about in terms of feeling physically, and then we're adding emotionally safe. So I want to know that the things around me are not going to harm me. I want to know that the change effort that is occurring isn't going to be bad for me. That's what this need is all about. Inclusion is a need to be part of the inner circle, a part of the team, so to speak, on the inside, part of what's happening. You know, this is a very common mistake. We see it all the time in leaders when they lead change, is that they leave people out of inputting to the design solution. And they don't engage them until far down in implementation. Well, by that time, people are being very resistant. Leaders often think, well, they're resistant because of the content of the change. What we're changing, they don't like it. Well, they just got to live with it. Well, it's not necessarily so. What we see over and over again is that the resistance comes because the way in which the leaders designed their change efforts. They didn't engage people early enough in the change process. The next core need that gets triggered is power. Now this one is very common. You know, and it's at the heart of the command and control leadership style that still exists in many organizations. What people are worried about in change is who will end up with the power. Will the power shift? Will they or their team or their department or their region get more power or less power? You know, we see this all the time as a major issue in mergers. People will resist the change until they find out who the new CEO will be or who the new what the new company's name will be. Now, if it's their CEO or their existing name, then all of a sudden you'll notice that their shoulders will go down because they'll be more comfortable with the change because the power issue in them has not been triggered because they're assuming, hey, our CEO got the job, we're going to have more power. Things are going to be more like our organization than their organization. Another very common core need that gets triggered is control. Now, this happens more often in transformational change than other types of change like developmental or transitional change because transformation is so chaotic. You know, the path from here to our final destination is never a straight line. So there are constant course corrections. And people feel out of control. So they need order. They need a predictable map to follow. They need to understand the next step, what their role is going to be, what's going to happen next week, next month. And in transformation, often it's difficult to lay out an exact straight line path to where we're going. So this core need is very, very common these days in terms of it being triggered and changed. Next is competence. Now, everybody likes to feel competent because it's the essence of their self-esteem. When I don't know what's going to happen in the future, and it sounds like I might get thrust into a new job, or I need to learn a new piece of software, or I have to be part of a team that I don't know what they do, those things will trigger competence needs. Because what I want to do is I want to add value. Right? I want to know that I'm contributing. I want people to think of me highly in that way. And so this need gets triggered quite often when we don't communicate to people what the training plan is going to be associated with the new state that we're implementing. This is a very common core need also in a lot of the software implementations, which we'll talk about shortly. Justice and fairness is the next core need. People need to know that things are going to be equitable, that they're going to be fair. You know, when they begin to see nepotism or favoritism or the political dynamic occur in the organization, then that core need of justice gets triggered, and then we see all kinds of resistance. Next is the desire to be liked and to be connected. You know, people want to be treated with regard. They want to be held in a positive way and respected. They want to be cared about. And so if they feel that leaders are not considering their needs in a change effort, then this need gets triggered in very large ways. And this need is very deep and can often be hard to overcome as a change leader. So there we have it. We have 7 core needs. And what we're suggesting in our research is that when we get underneath the behavioral patterns of resistance, where people are putting their heels in or not participating or withdrawing, we begin to really understand what's occurring for them. One of these issues is triggered for them. Now, keep in mind a couple things here. Most people are not in touch with their core needs. So if you ask them, why are you being resistant, you'll get an answer like, well, I don't like the change. I don't believe in it. I think it's bad for the company. It's bad for the customer. But if you stay with that conversation and you know how to begin to make it more personal, and they join you in that kind of personal disclosure, what you'll discover is they're worried about something on this slide. And so what our job in the role of change leadership or change consultant is that we need to design our change processes so that we do not trigger these needs inadvertently, and that we add activities and tasks that help people resolve the core need, and then what we notice is resistance begins to go away. All right, let's talk about strategies for each of the needs. For security needs, we need to announce any protections we can early in the process. For example, if we're not going to downsize, let's tell people. If we're going to protect pay, let's tell people. If we're going to protect comp and benefits, let's tell people. Now, the reason you want to do this is because most people fear the monster in the closet. In other words, what they don't know, they'll make up stories in their minds about that it's negative. And so if we know that we're not going to downsize or do something that's going to trigger a security need, we need to let them know right from the beginning. And we need to share both what we know as well as what we don't know, because surprises are what trigger security needs. People do not like to be surprised. When the door opens and the light's out, that's a scary moment, and they'll make up the story that it must be bad. Strategies for inclusion needs are all about getting people involved. Now, you don't necessarily need to just get their hands involved in doing something. You can get their minds and hearts involved, about asking about how they feel about it or what they think about it. So very early in the change process, before you've even designed your solution, so way back at visioning or even before that during building your case for change, you can get people involved by asking them to give input or feedback, and to also use those opportunities to engage them in any early action that you can. But keep in mind early, what they simply need to know is that they're on the inner circle. They are somehow involved on the inside of the change. Because when they feel the change is thrust on them from the outside, that's what always will automatically trigger resistance. Now, specific to people with inclusion needs are issues around membership. So that if you have no team member changes going on in your change, then be sure to announce that early. Now, if you do have team member changes and you are going to shuffle people around, then you've got to follow up implementation with team building as quickly as possible so that people begin to get familiar with each other and they begin to feel as valid members of the new team. From a power needs standpoint, keep in mind that if you're doing a restructure, make sure that you announce senior positions early. Because again, people will immediately begin to feel if their senior leader is now someplace else in a different department or a different region, and somebody that has come from the outside, that will quickly trigger their power issues. Also, find ways to give them influence. The bottom line to power issues is that people want to know they have enough power to have influence over their domain so that they can produce what they want. If they see any indication that they're no longer going to have enough power to have influence over their world, that's what will trigger resistance. Now, one of the key things is making decision-making overt. This includes the roles, like who's making the decision, who's inputting the decision, who's an advisor, right, who has veto power, and the style. That means, is this consensus? Is this leader dictates? Is this majority vote? Right? And also the process. Who's going to give input, when you're going to make the decision, when the decision will be announced, etc. It's very critical that people understand the decision-making process, because decision-making, of course, is where power gets distributed. Now, one of the things that I'd like to share with you right now is a very good resource that's an information sheet called Decision-Making Style, Roles, and Processes in the Change Leaders Roadmap. Now, if you're a subscriber to the roadmap, you can easily access that. Just use the search function and you'll find that info sheet. It's very valuable. If you're not a subscriber, you can go online and use the 30-day free trial and also access that info sheet and download that. And that's at www.changeleadersroadmap.com. Now, one thing I do want to tell you here, and this is the first announcement that we've made about this, is that do not subscribe to the Change Leaders Roadmap now. Our subscription fee is being radically reduced in the next couple weeks. It's currently $845 for access to the methodology for a year. We're basically going to be offering that for free for the next year, or about the next year, for a minor administration fee of about $29. And the reason we're doing that is that we expected to turn that resource into a full-blown piece of database-driven software by now, and we haven't met that deadline. So what we're going to do to kind of walk our own talk of customer service is we're going to make the content of the methodology free for the next year, and then by the end of next spring, early summer, we'll have that application up and running. So I just wanted to give you that tip. So if you go on and get this info sheet and get excited about the methodology, I don't want you to go subscribe right now. Okay, next is strategies for control needs. Absolutely create and communicate your change strategy and process plan early. Do not let time go by without being able to announce the major milestones of your change effort so people can begin to see a path. Even if they're very high level, simply to say we'll have our vision done in March, we'll have our design solution done by the end of August, we'll be implementing in December. Now, if you can break it down, and you will be able to as time goes on, but if you can break it down earlier, so much the better. And again, this is one of the major advantages of using the Change Leaders Roadmap, because it gives you that roadmap and makes it very easy for you to customize it very quickly, so that early in the change effort you can give more specific information to your stakeholders about the steps in your change process, so that your change process design will not trigger control needs. because those are often a very large source of resistance. Now, in working with people to minimize control issues, one of the core components is communication. So building your communication plan early and really making it clear to people how you will make decisions, when they are made, and to keep people informed about progress, course corrections on a regular, timely basis. And as we said earlier, don't just communicate about what you do know, also communicate what you don't know and when you will know it, because all of that provides order for people with control issues. Right? Now, a very big and powerful strategy for this need is to catalyze conversations early, but catalyze them with teams at local levels so that those teams can understand the impacts the change may have. Now, you may think early in the change process, well, they won't know the impacts because we haven't designed the solution yet. You know what? That doesn't actually matter. What matters is that people are engaged in conversations where they're surfacing with their team members best and worst case scenarios about how the change may go. Because what that's doing is it's actually moving them through their emotional transition because they're being able to voice their concerns and their worries about the monster in the closet. Strategies for competence needs. Announce training plans early. Do not wait. Let people know they will be trained. Tell them how they will be trained, what their learning expectations will be, what kind of resources that you will provide. And absolutely make sure that they know that you will match your expectations about their job responsibility, success, and competence to a realistic learning pace based on the resources you're putting in your change plan. Now, a common thing that we see these days in software implementations, because there are so many of those going on, is leaders will come to us and say, you know, our people are resisting the software and the solution that we've come up with. And when we get in there and begin to talk to stakeholders, what we discover is they're not actually resisting the content of the solution. What they're resisting is the fact that they think they're going to be thrown into having to use new tools that they don't know how to use. Now, a recent one for us was a big EMR implementation, which is electronic medical records in a large healthcare system. And the doctors and nurses and the caregivers were resisting, so to speak, the change. But when it was all said and done, they weren't resisting the change at all. They thought the EMR plan was a great plan. What they were resisting was the fact that there was an inadequate training plan and that they felt that their patient care and safety was going to be jeopardized by the implementation. As soon as the client rolled out to that stakeholder group a very robust training plan, the resistance immediately went away. Justice and fairness. This is all about transparency. It's all about people understanding that the change will be run in a fair and equitable way. Decisions will be made in a fair and equitable way. If you're doing a restructure, make sure that you post job selection criteria early. Make sure people know how jobs will be filled, what the decision will be, who will be making the decision. And if it's a team-based decision, then make sure you have equal representation on multifunctional teams. Don't put all the most powerful people in line organization, for example, on the team from one function and then misrepresent or underrepresent the other functions, because the people on that side of the fence will, of course, feel resistant. Another very important one here is to treat people fairly. You know, if you're not treating people fairly, then what will happen in the grapevine is that you will begin to see a significant negative turn in terms of people's morale about the change. Strategies related to being liked and connected are all about showing care and concern. Now, what's really important here to understand is that people that have this core need really like high touch. Right? They want to be talked to face-to-face. You know, if you can't, then the phone is best as the next solution, but email is last. So if you're relying on one-way email blasts from the top, that even though you're doing it frequently and you think this is a great communication plan, we're staying connected to people, people that have this core need will not feel served. They will feel left out because you're not taking the time to touch them in a way that actually resonates with them. So yes, do stay in contact, make frequent contact, but if you know that your stakeholder groups have this need, then you've got to slow down the change enough to be able to do more face-to-face contact. Now this one comes up a lot in downsizing. And keep in mind, any change effort that says we're going to be more efficient will trigger people's issues around, is my job going away, right? And are my partner, my team members' jobs going away? And so they'll worry about their core need, unconsciously of course, but their core need about being connected. So be careful in downsizing around this one and use as much face-to-face as you can. And anytime you use the words of more efficiency, then make sure that you are watching your stakeholder groups for resistance, because this may be the culprit. All right, so there we have it. Core needs. Now let's take a leap into looking at emotional reactions to change. Now why is this important? Well, underneath all resistance is an emotional reaction. And people go through a transition curve as they sort through their emotions to a change. So what happens in this curve is if you support people properly through it, then you will notice that as they move through it, their resistance will fall away and commitment will take its place. Now this work that I'm going to introduce here is not being first source. This comes from good friends of ours, John Adams and Sabina Spencer, and it's used with their permission. What we've done over the last 20 years is to make robust strategies around this model, because we saw for a long, long time that this model is absolutely accurate to the transitions that people go through. All right, first stage, losing focus. This is when you announce the change. People can't believe it's happening. They're shocked. They go into that kind of shell shock state. Now, what they'll do after that is they'll begin to minimize the impact. They'll begin to say to themselves and their teammates and around the water cooler, this isn't really going to happen. We've had this, before. Let's just duck. It will go away too. All those other changes that we've tried to do in the last 10 years. So many, so few of them have not stuck. Right? So they'll go into a whole repertoire of conversations and behaviors to try to minimize the impact, because they don't want to believe it's true. Once they see it's true, they'll often go into the pit. In other words, they'll just drop into that state of fear, anger, or sadness, having grief, being pissed off. And when they move through that, finally, they'll begin to let go of the past. Now, the key here is, how do you move people from the pit to letting go of the past? And we'll talk about that as we talk about strategies for each of these stages. Now, as people go into stage 4 and begin to let go of the past, they're still feeling grief. They're still holding on to the past to some degree. They haven't let go of it entirely. Then they begin to test the limits. Right? So now they're saying, okay, I'm here, I'm letting go of the past, and they begin to bargain and get curious about, well, what's the new reality? What's the new state going to be like? And they begin to test the limits. Now, for some people in this stage, they will ask for forgiveness. In other words, they'll go test the limits in a big way. Others will be asking for permission. Now, keep this in mind. Those folks that are asking permission, you actually want to give them the opportunity to test the limits. You want to encourage them to test the limits, because it's through testing the limits that they begin to literally put both feet, on the boat. They had both feet on the shore or the dock. They stranded or straddled from the dock to the boat, and now they are in the boat. But they're not sure about the boat. Is it going to be a rocky ride? Are they going to find a place for themselves? So you want them to test the limits, because that's how they integrate emotionally into the new state. Now, once they begin to find home, now what they're really looking for is meaning. Right? They're beginning to feel hopeful. They want to know that this change really is going to add value. It's going to be good for the customer. It's going to be good for the company. It's going to be good from their team, their department, and themselves. And so what's key in this stage is to really show people that value is, in fact, part of this change. And then finally, they integrate. Now they're in the new state. Now they're saying, okay, let's go. We got it. We're in the boat. Let's drive this thing. Let's be wildly successful. And now they're feeling confident. All right, there. So there's the emotional transition curve. Now, there's a couple important things to understand about this. First of all, is the objective is not, underline not, to keep people from the pit. People go into the pit. That is a natural response. It's not a bad place. So the objective is not to go from 2 to 7. The objective is to support people through the natural emotional transition they are going to go through. Now let's look at the strategies. Well, excuse me, let me give you this overview slide. So this is a natural process, and you cannot force it to go faster. And in fact, the more you force it, the more you slow it down, right? Because when you're trying to talk people out of the pit or keep people from going into a negative place, that keeps them stuck because they don't have a chance to emotionally resolve the fear and anxiety they may be feeling. So there are strategies to actually move them through the pit quickly, but not to skip it. And that people will work themselves through this, but they will get to the other side. The question always is, what's the degree of commitment they're going to have on the other side? Now, if you support them well, they will come out fully committed. If your change is the right thing for the company to do, I'm going to assume that it is. If you do not support them well, you may get them to comply, you may get them to agree to go along with, but you will not open up that inner space of commitment in themselves where they will source their own optimal performance and contribution to the future state. Okay, so here we are in stage one, losing focus. Now the strategies for losing focus. It's all about keeping people attending to their current job priorities and tasks. Because what you want to do is you want to make sure that they continue to do their current job well early in the change. So you want to keep them grounded in a focus on today, right? As you're opening up the conversation around, here's the case for our change, here are our desired outcomes, here's our vision for it, right? Because you've announced it, but you don't have the design solution in place. So you don't want them all of a sudden worrying about the change. You want them to begin to integrate, yes, we're going to change, but we still got a job to do today. So you might gently increase check-ins and progress reports, stay in close contact with people where you start to see early signs of resistance. And you want to make very explicit requests, right? So SMART, right? SMART request, specific and measurable, right? Achievable, realistic, time-bound. In other words, you're asking them to stay very focused on their current responsibilities. And as you're talking about the change, don't take the approach of this is a formal announcement, it's very stiff, here's the party line coming from the top. The conversation you want to initiate early in the change process is the casual water cooler conversation, where you just begin to get people to think, I wonder what this is going to be about. I wonder how it's going to go. What might the impacts be? Now, the reason you want to do that is because the next stage, again, is all about minimizing the impact. They're going to go into a place saying, well, this isn't really going to happen. It's just going to pass. So the strategies to move them and support them properly through minimizing the impact is all about information. It's all about giving them everything you can give them about why you're changing in terms of the case for change, what your outcomes are going to be, what the expected benefits are going to be, how you think it's going to be better for customers, et cetera. And you want them to begin to discuss, right, in their own local teams, in the hallways, the scenarios and possibilities for the future, because that's how it begins to be real for them. And specifically, if you find stakeholder groups that are very resistant, then convene team meetings where you are holding meetings for them to discuss with each other how they think the change will impact them and their team. Now remember, this is all scenario. This is all, I think it's going to be bad, it's going to go this way, we're going to lose this, we're not going to be able to do this anymore. Whatever the specifics are for them, negative or positive, is what the heart of that discussion wants to be. It does not have to be positive. What's important here in minimizing the impact is that the people supporting the change leaders and consultants need to understand that in this stage, you are busting open their fantasy that this isn't real. And when you do that, they will often move into the pit, right? And that's okay. That's the natural progression of how emotional transition goes. So when they feel that it's real, they're still going to fantasize the monster in the closet. Okay, well, that's what goes on. So what your job now in the pit is to be with them in their feeling state, right? Help them acknowledge how they feel. Now, I'm going to stop right there for a moment. So think about this. If somebody's deeply sad or angry or frustrated and they don't like what's going on, most of us have been trained by society not to feel those feelings, not to embrace them, not to open ourselves to them, not to let ourselves feel them too much. And in fact, we're often taught as kids not to talk about them. Don't say you're angry. Don't say you're afraid. And what happens is, for most adults, is that those feelings end up getting stuck in them because they don't know how to befriend them and process them. So the mere fact of asking people what they're thinking, asking them how they feel about the change, will begin to give them the opportunity to vocalize how they're feeling. Now, what your job to do as a change support agent, a leader or a consultant, is your job is simply to listen. Right? Your job is to listen to them, be with them, help them feel heard. Now, the tool here is active listening. So if you don't know that tool, go online, find a resource, or if you come to one of our trainings, we teach this all the time. Is reflect back to them what they hear, because your objective is to make sure they feel heard. Because when they feel heard, what begins to happen is they begin to resolve those feelings. The key here is that you do not want to fix them. You do not want to minimize their feelings. You do not want to communicate things like, oh, it's going to be okay, it's going to be great, this is going to add to greater service, we're going to innovate faster, we're going to reduce our costs, etc. You're not trying to market the position of the change. This is not about the content of the change right now. It's about them and their feeling state. Right? So you want to make sure that they feel heard. Now what happens is if you will hold the space for them to vocalize how they feel and not push back, not defend, not discount, then they will naturally move through the transition process. They will naturally begin to let go of the past as those emotions begin to resolve. Now, when you're in this stage, the key strategies are to begin to talk about the past as if it was gone. Now we're looking back at the past. So specifically, celebrate it. Talk about what went well in it, what our strengths were, right? But make sure that you're overt that it will no longer be. A great tool this, the roasts, the toasts, and the boasts. To talk about the past as if it was yesterday. Because the whole key here is to carry forward the good things of the past, but to make sure people know that we are now in the boat and we're leaving the dock. That then brings us to testing the limits. So people now are bargaining. Now you've been here before, right? You've seen this. You've watched people go into the pit, and then all of a sudden they begin to emerge on the other side. But they're confused. They don't know the lay of the land. They don't know the new world. They haven't yet learned their new jobs or the software they need to use or what the reporting structure is or their new team members in their new team, right? So what's your job here is to let them know how they fit in. Clarify everything you can about the current reality, how things will work. Clarify the boundaries, right? Give them options. Make them go figure stuff out, right? And this is where, again, you're allowing people to ask for forgiveness, not permission, right? One thing that destroys people when they're in this stage is when leaders are heavy-handed about, no, don't do that. What you want to do is that you want them to figure out things, because when they are figuring them out, that's how they're integrating from their head and heart to their hands, where they'll be fully engaged in the new state. Then, as they begin to find the new lay of the land, they're looking for meaning. Where's the value? How do we really contribute here? And so this is all about discussing the big picture value, about customer benefits, organizational benefits, and how they fit into the larger picture. In our methodology, in phase 8 is all about integration. And you integrate not just at the team level, but you integrate at the system level, right? That's where this stage really, really comes to fruition, where you begin to see how your team fits into the new function, how it fits into the way the new business model is going to serve customers, how you're going to integrate horizontally across functions, et cetera. And fundamentally, you want to tie the change to their personal and the organization's purpose. And the reason you do that, because that's how they bring their soul into the game. Right? So you were working all the time with their bodies. Right? You've been working with their emotional reactions and the mental framework and interpretations they make that cause those emotional reactions. Well, now they're clearly in the boat. They got their hands on the wheels. You want them to be completely engaged from a purpose and value standpoint. And lastly, that brings us into stage 7, which is all about integrating. You know, at this point, people are feeling confident. And so now you're putting them to work. You support their success. You give them the coaching, the resources. You announce and celebrate positive behaviors and results, small steps they make, big accomplishments, right? And you make everybody complete owners of the new state because they're completely engaged in it with you. All right, so that brings us to another orientation here, which is all about commitment. So pause with me right here, and let's track where we've been. We've talked about core needs. We see that they're underneath resistance. We see that people are feeling resistance. They're in an emotional state that goes through a natural transition. What we really care about is commitment. How do we get commitment? Well, first of all, commitment cannot be forced on anyone. Right? Commitment is something that's self-generated. It comes from the inside. So in leadership, we have basically 2 fundamental ways of motivating, the carrot and the stick. And you see this all the time. Think of leaders in your organization. You know, who in your organization uses the carrot and who uses the stick? Well, the stick is all about fear. It's motivation from the outside in. You know, it's avoidance of pain and threat, you know, do this or else, punishment. But motivation by choice is all about attracting people to something better. Now, something better inherently means change, right? And so motivation by choice is painting the early picture of the value and the benefit and how things will be a better state for everyone and how they will contribute. But the fundamental difference here is that motivation by fear is from the outside, motivation by choice is the inside. So if we get underneath choice, what we realize is that we're not just marketing a position of someplace better, but we're engaging people in the conversation where they begin to internalize that so that in their hearts and minds, they live out of that place of choice, out of that place of, I want to contribute to this thing better. Okay, now keep this perspective about motivation in mind as we talk about levels of commitment. The bottom line here, we have resistance. Okay, so we're starting with people that are in resistance because that's the nature of our emotional transition journey from resistance to commitment. Now, how do I motivate? How do I engage? Well, if we're keeping the core needs in mind and the stages of transition, we are working with people using the strategies that we discussed. Now, we're using those strategies to match, we match our strategies to where people are. So early in the change process, they may be in shock, right? And then they go into minimizing resistance, and they go in the pit when they see it's real. And that's tracking from the being first perspective, the 9-phase model of we're starting off around building case for change and vision, and then we go into customer requirements and design. And by the time you get into customer requirements and design, you may very well see people in the pit. Okay, how do you interface? Well, use the strategies to move them through as we talked. But if you go to fear, and if some of your leaders go to fear, or if your executive team begins to get heavy-handed, then the best you can get is compliance and agreement. Right? You will get blocked right here and never really get people to buy in and commit. Now, what's critical to this, if you're an organization development consultant, for example, and maybe you do not have access to the executive team who are modeling certain behaviors, somehow you've got to find ways to help them understand how to engage in the human dynamic. Because if you are working in the positive ways we're discussing here today, but your leadership is actually modeling motivation by fear, then what will happen is once you get through implementation, your change effort will sputter. Now, how many change efforts have you seen in your organization where they just kind of linger after implementation, never really take root, never really develop and produce the outcomes they were intended? Well, 90% of the time, that's because the leadership style did not actually engage people in a way that led to commitment. So levels of commitment is all about motivating by choice, working with the strategies we've been talking about, because once people buy in with their hearts and minds, and you then engage them in action with their hands, they will develop commitment. It is a natural process, and it happens every time. Okay, so what's that mean for us here? Well, what that means is this curve really is a curve of going from resistance to commitment. You know, it's all about moving people through that emotional state. All right, now, there's a task in the CLR, in the Change Leaders Roadmap, I want to alert you to. It's task 1F6. It's design and initiate the strategies for helping people through their emotional reactions and resistance. And specifically, there's an info sheet about communicating with people who are emotionally triggered. I really suggest you take a look at that because there are some tips around the conversations you want to have along with the strategies we've talked about, so you're adding your communication approaches and skills to this to move people up the curve to commitment. Now let's talk specifically about building commitment. There are a number of strategies. Communication's the first one. You know, it's all about early in your change process, letting people know how the change will add value. And then listening. You know, getting them engaged in a dialogue about what they think about it very early. That way, the people that are in the pit early, you will have a strategy to get them out of the pit. And then request. As they begin to move forward in their commitment, ask them to be productive, right? Ask them to keep voicing their concerns in healthy ways. Yes, push back on this. Let's keep the dialogue open, but make a specific request of people to stay open and consider the merits, right? Don't shut down their voice. Don't shut down the concerns they have, because then they will stay stuck in that stage of transition and stuck in their resistance, right? But do make specific requests to simply consider the merits, and then keep the dialogue with them going. And then provide all the support they need. So ask what they need to commit, be overt about that, and provide as much of the support as you can, and absolutely positively reinforce their small steps. That's how you will begin to move them off the dock into the boat with you. And then engage. You know, at the beginning, it's all about thoughts. Right? You get them involved in feedback, and as you go, it's more about their hands. Positively reinforce everything they do that's a contribution to the change. Celebrate all those small successes. Praise them throughout the change process. Right? And where that leaves us is people have universal needs. And so as they move through this commitment, they have these core needs, but they also want to contribute. That's the self-actualization need. So as you communicate with them, as you listen, make requests, provide information and support, engage them, know that they want to actually be a part of the positive future. And so the way that they can do that is to be supported through the transition. And that the resistance will occur when the needs aren't met, and your job is to simply support them in a way where they go away, right? Where those core needs begin to go away so that natural transition can occur. And commitment is only internally generated. It's not something you can lay on them. So as you do this work, the key point is always not to market why they should not feel the way they feel, but instead support them where they're at so a commitment will emerge, and it absolutely will. And then that leads to this last point of consciously design your change process and to get your executive team and your leaders to design the change process so that it doesn't inadvertently trigger resistance. Because the vast majority of resistance comes not because people resist the content of the change, they resist how the change is being run. So instead of inadvertently triggering resistance, support people to commit. Now, the content that we've been talking about around core needs, around the transition curve, and around commitment, it all comes out of our body of knowledge from a course that we do around leading people through the human dynamics of change. I know a lot of you are clients and kind of long-time participants with Being First, so you may know this, but we don't do very many public trainings. We've decided here this summer that we're going to begin to offer more public trainings because of the request. And if this content is important to you, I just want to inform you that this course on leading people through change that goes deeply into what we've talked about in this hour will actually be offered for the first time publicly in December. It's on the 10th and 11th, and you can go to beingfirst.com to find out more about that. Okay, so Marcy, there we are. I want to thank everybody for your engagement and participation today. I know we've got people from all over the globe on the call, so thank you very much for those of you that are in the late evenings and the nighttime for being on the call. And Marcy, I'd like to give it back to you because it's time for us to answer any questions. And there's a way that you can, Marcy, you going to go ahead and tell people about the question process?
I sure will. Thanks, Dean. And thank you all for joining.